Today, my talk is going to be about cognitive computing, artificial intelligence, in particular, how it's applied to life sciences. My background for this, if you're interested, is I've been doing machine learning and text mining at IBM Research for 20 years, and then recently moved over to the Watson Health organization, where I'm responsible for a product called Watson for Drug Discovery, which you'll hear more about as I talk. I think one of the things I wanted to start with is, artificial intelligence has been around quite a while. In fact, I was doing some of the early AI applications back in the 80s, and a lot has changed in that time. I think especially very recently, developments have occurred that have suddenly made it much more relevant and much more practical for the kinds of problems we deal with every day. And these three components have really come together, and I think they're kind of ordered here in order of importance in my mind. The key factors that have changed and revolutionized how AI is applicable to our lives today. The first is we're all familiar with how much data there is out there. And it's not just data for data's sake. There's actually so much data that's incredibly relevant to what we do as scientists. We think about how much data Darwin had when he was doing science and how much data we have to deal with today in biology, and it's just many orders of magnitude more intense. If we're going to do science today, it's not just an option that we mine data, it's really a requirement to know what's relevant to our fields. And so this has become a key enabler and also a key driver of requirements in this area. The other thing we may not be as aware of is this idea of the cloud and how it allows us to scale computing very rapidly and on demand for applications. This really makes, again, much more practical. Take things that are in the lab before that only ran on supercomputers and suddenly make them available widely to as many people who want access to them as needed. And finally, we've heard a lot about deep learning and new applications of neural networks to these problems. These applications aren't really all that new. We had neural networks back in the 80s. We have a lot of the same machine learning techniques we had before. What I think is really new, though, is we've understood a lot better how to apply them, where they're most effective, where they're less effective, and how to use all that data and computing power in new ways to make these applications become much more powerful. So when you think about this evolution, where do we apply these techniques? I think before, we could only apply them in very narrow areas. Our example here is identifying cats. But when I was doing AI back in the 80s, it was things called knowledge-based systems or expert systems. And the reason they both succeeded and failed, they succeeded because they were very narrowly focused on a particular expert's domain. And then eventually they failed because they were so narrowly focused that when things changed over time, the systems couldn't adapt fast enough. They required too much programming. But now we have the ability, using the techniques we've discovered in reading unstructured information and mining all that data, to actually keep things current as the data changes. And that allows us to really go beyond the narrow applications to things that are much more broad. And those are the kinds of applications that we're going to talk about today. When we get into the next third of the chart, where we talk about the general AI, this is, in my opinion, something we really haven't made much progress at all in the last 30 years. In fact, I think we're still just as far away from general intelligence as we were then. So think about AI as practical when it's partnering with the human, when it's allowing the human to be smarter, not when it's trying to do the problem all by itself and think in a common sense way the way humans do. So I wanted to have a theme for this talk, and so I came back to one of my favorite heroes. How many people in this audience know who Mr. Rogers is? I see a very small smattering of hands. I'm not surprised. It's a very American character. So when I was 5 years old, there was a guy who came on the television and talked to me in a way that I could understand. And he explained things that were very difficult and scary concepts like divorce and terrorism to a child in a way that the child could understand and feel comfortable with. And that's really what I want to do for you now in this talk. I want to explain a scary concept like artificial intelligence that sounds like it's something that's going to, replace humans and do terrible things to us, and really talk about it in a way that you feel comfortable with and is not scary. And one of the quotes from Mr. Rogers I feel is very apropos in many different ways to the way I think about how to do artificial intelligence in life sciences. And the idea here is that you can create complex algorithms that do amazing things on very specific problems, but I don't think that's really the way to do good science. I think the best kinds of solutions are the simple ones, but there are also the deep ones, the ones that go deep into the domain and understand the domain the way that a domain expert does. It's not about the most complex algorithm, because the most complex algorithm is often the one that's too specific to the data you gave it and doesn't generalize over time into deeper, more interesting problems. So in all the principles I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to come back to this idea of deep and simple is much more effective in the long run to solving problems in life sciences. So I came up with these 10 kind of corollaries or guidelines for doing AI that really follow Mr. Rogers' law. In the next set of slides, I'm going to kind of go over each of these with examples of what I mean by these principles. And then in the rest of the talk, I'm going to give you some examples of how we implement those principles in discovery and life sciences in our applications. I'm going to really try to leave some time at the end for questions, so however far I get in all this content I'm going to talk to you about, I'm probably just going to wrap it up with about 15 minutes left. So be thinking about your questions and hold them for that time, and let's have a discussion, because I really want to know what's on your mind and what kind of things are interesting to you in this AI space. So the first rule is about interpolation versus extrapolation. I put our handy graph here just so we're all on the same page. What I mean by this is you've got certain known data points, and what you're trying to do with artificial intelligence is make predictions beyond the known to things which are implied by the known. And you can do this two ways. You can look for things that are in the same neighborhood as the points you already know, or you can look for things that are way outside the boundaries of what you know. And it's my belief that AI should really stick, for the most part, to the things that are interpreted from those known data points and not go outside to the things that are extrapolated. So think about it as more implication than prediction. And I think that's the kind of effective AI that will really help you in your daily work. And to be honest, there's so much we don't know that exists between what we know that it is really implied that you can really do amazing science in that area that goes beyond the simple things you read and the facts that are extracted from text. The second thing is, we know in science that everything we read is not true. It's not true for a number of reasons. There could be mistakes that were made. It could be the experiments weren't carefully validated. It could be that we learn something later that contradicts what we learned before. So we're all very skeptical as scientists, and we expect our AI to be skeptical too, or at least it should be. And so to do that, we need to have this ability to score or provide a confidence value for everything that we learn. And there's many ways to do this, but one way that I found particularly effective and very general and also very simple is this idea of two factors coming into play. One is, how often do we see a particular fact in the literature? How well is it supported? How well is it independently verified by other entities? And the second is, how consistent is that fact with everything else we know about the principal entity? So if, say, one gene is proposed to be interacting with another gene, do those two genes act in a consistent way with this new fact, or is this new fact very unusual and thus very suspect? So you can use these two factors in combination, create an actual equation, measure that equation against existing known and unknown or mistakes, and basically create a p-value that accurately estimates whether or not a fact is true in literature. This is something we use in all of our research, all of our applications, to help the scientists be aware of where there are, fundamental ambiguities or things that may not be true in what they're reading. The next principle is really about explanation. It's our belief that simply proposing a prediction, proposing a new line of research is not enough. You need to be able to explain why you think that's a new prediction that you should be aware of and could be valuable to you. So I give you an example from a real-life use case where we're looking for a new target for bladder cancer, and we propose that CD4 might be a good gene for that, but we don't have any evidence of this in the literature. The prediction itself is made based on many different factors, based on thousands of features and an equation. But in fact, we can make an analogy to what's already known about both the gene and about the cancer, and look for existing connections that do exist in the literature. And here we show in this set of features a set of pathways that CD4 is involved in that's also involved in breast cancer. And we provide links back to the literature evidence that shows the involvement of CD4 and the disease in those pathways. So in a sense, we draw an analogy to what we predicted back to the things that we know. And through doing that, we give the scientists confidence that the prediction is valid and is relevant to the context of what they're thinking about. The next concept is about the idea that structure implies behavior. So what do I mean by that? It's the idea that when two things behave the same way, it's probably because there's an underlying structural similarity that causes that behavior. What that means is because they're structurally similar, when we see other behaviors, we would expect these two things to share those behaviors. So that's really a nice property because it allows us to do some reasoning about the unknown. Because if I have a gene, say, that is not known to be relevant to a given disease, but it's another gene it's similar to in its behavior that is known to be relevant to that disease, we can make an assumption or a prediction that the gene to disease connection really does exist. And this matrix factorization approach is one that a very simple mathematical technique to quantify that prediction in terms of a floating point number that we can then use to rank predictions overall. The next idea is very powerful because as scientists, we want to understand how much we should trust predictions. And we want to be able to see for ourselves that these predictions will pan out, most likely, and be true. So how can we do that when we don't know the future? One way is to look at the past. We can tell our systems to only look up at data up to a certain point in time and ignore everything else that was published after that point in time. That allows us to essentially travel back in time as if we were naive about what would happen in the future, and use as our training data that older data, and then predict what happens in the future. And the newer data then becomes our validation data. So by splitting our known set up in this way between training and validation and doing it in a chronological fashion, we can actually gain confidence that the approach we're using is actually going to work when we start to model things that we haven't seen yet. We'll also get a sense for how many errors we see as a result of doing that kind of prediction, and how many false positives are we going to include with our set of rankings. So we can make a lot of predictions, but how do we know which predictions are interesting? It's often a difficult problem, and it's easy to make some predictions which are not as interesting as others. So for example, we might predict that P53 has a real connection to lots of cancer genes, but big deal, P53 has connections everywhere. Predicting a new one isn't all that interesting. So why is something interesting? That's really actually not so clear. What's the mathematical concept of interesting is? So one thing that we found that works very well is this idea of unlikelihood. So here I'm showing a prediction that's made through matrix factorization has a certain score, but you can compare that raw score to the actual expected score based on the number of connections those two entities have in the network. That expected score minus the observed score can be used as comparison using the standard deviation to come up with a z-score, which then converts into a probability. So now we have a way to say the most interesting things are likely to be the things that are least probable. And that gives us another way to suggest things that are going to be most helpful to the scientist. Finally, a few sort of simple guidelines. People often don't understand what AI is really good for. They want to ask a question and just get the answer. That seems like a natural approach, but in reality, that's not usually where you're going to find the most insight. I think the most important thing that AI can do for you as a scientist is to help you find the right question. Look for a better question than the one you're currently asking. And because AI has the ability to see so much more information, to see the stuff that you're not able to read because you just can't ingest enough information in your own brain, it really has the ability to widen your horizons and find that question that's going to be most helpful to you. So think about AI as being this annoying assistant that's sitting right next to you. It's helping you collaborate, but it's always asking you, what about X? Have you thought about this? And it's really helping you to stop thinking about things in the same old way and look for new approaches that you haven't thought of yet. The next principle is about using what you know to understand what you don't know. And in this diagram, we're showing this idea of graph diffusion. You build a network of known entities, the things that you're aware of that work well in a given treatment or a given disease area as your guideposts. And you tell the system about these, but then you also see what's nearby. You build a graph that explains or characterizes entities based on everything we know about them and draws connections based on similarity. You can then use those known entities as heat diffusers. These are heat sources, and the heat that diffuses over the network, and the candidate entities that are warm become the ones you want to pursue and investigate further. So you're using essentially those known areas to illuminate the unknown areas. And so that's a very important way that we help guide the system towards the predictions that are most helpful for what we care about. That brings us to our next point. The most important thing about learning something new is that the very first thing you should do is catalog what it is you already know about a field. And that actually turns out to be one of the hardest parts, and maybe harder than you realize, because it takes a lot of work to figure out everything that you really do know and describe it to the system so that it knows it too. But that's the work you really need to do. It's hard work, but you have to do it. The better you do it, the better the solutions you get at the end are going to be. So if you want to work in this field, get used to the idea of putting in the work to do the training. And finally, persistence is a virtue. I mean this in a couple of different ways. One, sort of the obvious thing is that you're going to have a lot of failures. This is still a new science, and you'll choose the wrong problem, you'll choose the wrong training set, you realize at the end you didn't quite configure things correctly. But keep at it. And the good thing about these systems is they're persistent. The learning that you have will be saved over time, and they'll get better. Whereas the person you hire, to learn this from you might go to some other company in a couple of years. You'll lose them. But the nice thing about AI is that they're there forever. And so save your work as you go. One of the things we build into our tools is the ability to save every analysis that you do over time, to save all your training sets, and to keep building on that, and to create better and better solutions over time. So those are the principles. Now, how do we actually put those into practice in my work? One of the things we've done recently is called Watson for Drug Discovery. And it's a really interesting approach. It's based on this idea of start with the knowledge at the bottom layer. And this is all the structured and unstructured content you can lay your hands on, both publicly and privately. Build on top of that a cognitive layer that can do the extraction of features, do the reasoning and the prediction. And then finally create a layer that communicates cognitive and person, that builds that connection through visualization. Because when the system makes a prediction, it's going to do it based on thousands of facts, hundreds of sources, To be able to understand that as a scientist, you're going to have to be able to see all those connections at once and drill in on the ones you want to really know more about. And that's where visualization becomes